So what we decided to do instead is to go to areas that have got naturally high levels of carbon dioxide to see what the seabed looks like and what organisms can live in those areas. Now luckily in Europe we're surrounded by volcanoes, lots and lots of volcanoes. And that's the map of Sicily on the left hand side there, and to the north of Sicily you've got all these crosses and little dots that are actually giant underwater volcanoes. And those volcanoes are emitting outrageously high amounts of carbon dioxide into the water that therefore acidify the water. Mount Vesuvius is very famous, that's off the coast of Naples there. There's Mount Etna here in Sicily, another very famous volcano. Etna is thought to produce 10% of all the carbon dioxide of all the volcanoes on Earth. So it's very, very productive in terms of amount of carbon dioxide. A good place to find out what the effects of carbon dioxide are on the marine biology of the sea. The reason why there's so much carbon dioxide coming out of these volcanoes is that the seafloor of the Mediterranean is made of chalk, and it's being pushed by Africa, moving north, underneath the magma chambers of these giant volcanoes like Vesuvius and Etna, boiling that chalk, and the chalk comes out as gas, and it bubbles through the seabed in certain places. Now we can't use all of these volcanic emissions to study the effects of ocean acidification, because some of them emit nasty, noxious chemicals like hydrogen sulfide. Some of them are really, really hot. Boiling water is not a good analogue for what's going to happen in the course of the century. But there are places like this where it's coming out at ambient temperature. It hasn't got noxious chemicals within it, and it does have a vast area of seabed affected by long-term emissions of carbon dioxide. That guy, that's Ricardo, if anyone remembers Ricardo, and those are these bags of dye we're using to see what happens to the carbon dioxide and where it goes through the sea. Now when you roll over the back of the boat, where these volcanoes are, and look at the seabed and its ecology, this is the sort of thing you're faced with. So this is what the pH of the water is supposed to be like at the end of this century. And you look at this and you think, well actually, that looks pretty good to me. It's lovely, there's all sorts of species. There's a cloud of mysids swimming through a very verdant meadow of seagrass there. That seagrass is actually in decline in lots of parts of the Mediterranean, and yet it grows like billio there. But if you scoop up this sediment and look down a microscope at it, and that's what Malcolm Hart and I have been doing, look down the microscope at this sediment, it's just sand. There's no calcified organisms, little bugs in the sediment. They've gone. So the sand might look very pretty and nice and white, but it doesn't have all the diversity of organisms you'd expect to be living in it. If you pluck the grass blades and look at them under the microscope, you could normally see about 12 species of these coralline algae that I did my PhD on, all living cheek by jowl over the surface of that blade of grass. And you look on top of that coralline algae, you start to see snails and worms and all sorts of organisms that build their skeletons out of chalk. And yet, if you swim along a gradient of CO2 in the water to the levels of CO2 we predict for this century, those calcifiers are gone. When you look at the seabed, more or less anywhere, you could be in Plymouth, you could be in Canada, you could be in the Arctic, you could be in the tropics. What you tend to see, just under the surface of the water, is rock with sponges, pink coralline algae, like the stuff that's being passed around in the box, some sea urchins, there's a fish in the middle there, if you can just about see it camouflaged. That sort of stuff is what you see, normally. But if you swim along this gradient of carbon dioxide towards the volcano, things just change completely. The bubbles of carbon dioxide coming out of the seabed, and you can see that the ecology has changed. It's changed completely. There's absolutely loads of brown algae there, but no calcified algae. There's absolutely loads of little shrimp things living in amongst the seaweeds, but there aren't any sea urchins. Things have changed completely. And that is a concern, clearly. We published that work, but then got criticised quite quickly after it because they said, well, that's one place. How do you know that what's happening at this one volcano in Italy is going to be a good predictor of what's going to happen off Plymouth, or what's going to happen to the Great Barrier Reef, or anything else? We said, oh, okay, give us some money and we'll go and have a look at some other volcanoes. And that's what we've done. So some PhD students of mine in the audience are looking in other locations. So Joy, for example, is just back from these carbon dioxide vents off the north coast of what's that country again? Australia, yeah, up there, looking at Papua New Guinea. There's another student of mine looking at the Gulf of California. And I'm concentrating pretty much on the ones that are the Mediterranean because they're easy to get to, backwards and forwards from here. Those, by the way, lines on that are showing you the tectonic plates, and whenever there's tectonic plates of either subduction or plates moving apart, you get volcanoes. When you get volcanoes, you get carbon dioxide emitted from the seabed. And so we're basically going to these volcanoes to see if we can repeat what we found at one site in the Mediterranean at other sites. So here's what Papua New Guinea looks like. You've got Australia, the big island to the North Australia is Papua New Guinea. If you go to the east corner of Papua New Guinea, there are these 3 volcanoes, those are the black dots there. And at each of those volcanoes, away from the CO2, the seabed looks beautiful, some of the best coral reefs I've ever seen in my life. But when you swim along gradients of carbon dioxide, you find that the reef changes, just like it did in the Mediterranean, and actually exactly the same stuff's happening as you see in the Mediterranean. So you move from this complicated habitat with lots of types of corals, lots of types of fish, all living there. And if you'll notice, we swim along this tape into the area that's got greater and greater amounts of carbon dioxide in the water. And you'll hopefully see the same as what I recognised when I was there, that the seabed changes colour. It goes from being multicoloured to being much more green, and that's the reason for that is that the algae that bore into the skeletons of the aragonite do better at high CO2. CO2, after all, is a fertiliser for plants, and the plants do well. There's the CO2 bubbling up to the reef. Luckily, though, we found that there were a few species of coral that could survive the levels of CO2 we predict at the end of this century. So that's kind of good news. There's one of them. That's Porites, a large dome-forming coral. But if you look at the coral, all of the inside of the coral is dissolved away. It's like a rotten tooth. Okay? That's not normal. Normally, these Porites have got dense skeletons that build up over thousands of years to form barriers against coastal erosion, allow islands like the Maldives to build up slowly. Here, these just dissolve away, they crumble away at the CO2 levels we predict. So, don't buy real estate in Micronesia, is what this is saying. This is inevitable. The coral itself will protect its skeleton, but as soon as the skeleton is exposed to the corrosive nature of the seawater, we're not talking acidic seawater below pH 7, we're talking seawater up about pH 7.6. That is corrosive to the skeletons of this aragonite, and the reef dissolves away. Some people don't like this sort of mensurative approach where you just swim around, writing things down and saying this is what's going to happen. They prefer you to do experiments to back up what you're seeing. And so we've done a series of experiments transplanting organisms both in and out of these carbon dioxide vents. So there's a zoomed in picture of what coral looks like. Coral in the tropics tends to have algae living in its polyps, and that's why it gives it a green colour. And we wanted to know what would happen to these corals if you move them into areas with high CO2. Now it depends. What you find depends on when you do it. If you do it most of the time of the year, this is what you find. The corals absolutely love it. They grow really, really well. The polyps grow plump up, they get really big. The algae within the polyps are doing really super well because they rely on carbon dioxide. But if you transplant these corals at the peak temperatures of the summer, the whole thing just dies off. Okay? Now I'll take a moment to describe why that's bad news. If you do these transplants of the coral into an area that's warm but doesn't have CO2, they're fine. Okay? But if you take the corals and put them into an area that's got CO2 and is warm, that kills them all off. And that's a major problem and a major concern because CO2 is not only making the seawater more acidic, it's also warming the atmosphere, which is warming the surface waters of the planet, and therefore killing large amounts of corals worldwide through bleaching, and not only bleaching, but they're dissolving as well. And if you take nothing else from this lecture, it's the fact that biodiversity loss does occur when you increase carbon dioxide levels, and that's what this picture is showing you. You move from a system that's got all sorts of planktonic organisms in the water to a system that doesn't. It's only got a few tolerant organisms like these jellyfish. And this graph here is showing the black dots are non-calcified organisms, the white dots are calcified organisms, and that biodiversity loss occurs across the board, whether you're a calcifier or not, as you increase carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, which are the numbers on the top, or as you decrease the pH of the water, biodiversity goes down. And that's repeatable no matter where you go on the planet. If you're in Mexico, or if you're in Papua New Guinea, or if you're off Italy or Greece, it's the same story everywhere you go. And this is what it looks like on the surface of the water of Papua New Guinea. It's an amazing place. And this is what it looks like on the surface of the water of Papua New Guinea. It's an amazing place. The coral reefs are really, really good. They don't have roads, they don't have money, they don't use outboard engines, and these people are basically not relying on burning fossil fuels for their livelihood. And so they're obviously very, very pissed off, and they get this. They are pissed off with us because we're producing so much CO2, it's dissolving their reefs. They don't have any money, they're not benefiting at all. And so I think these are the people that really should be suing nations legally for what we're doing to the seas. Now, solutions include improving to this problem, include improving the resilience of coastal ecosystems. Because if you've got protected areas, they'll have more species in them, bigger organisms in them, and there'll be a system that's much more resilient to other stresses. Okay? If you relieve a bit of stress from a system, it can cope with some of those stresses like CO2. That's a good thing to do. I think making the legal case, this is what I'm working on at the moment, is important. You've got to make the legal case that CO2 is a pollutant. It's like making the legal case that cigarettes are bad for your health. It's quite a big battle because there are people that think that, well, we shouldn't say that cigarettes are bad for your health. We shouldn't say that CO2 is bad. We breathe CO2 in and out every day. How on earth can it be considered a poison? But clearly it is poisonous to the coral reefs, and at levels that are high enough to be poisonous to food chains that we rely upon. So that's another part of the solution. I think advocacy, when you get this information, you need to tell the right people about that information. I don't think scientists should be removed from the dirty business of persuading people why their stuff's important. You should get in amongst there. And education is important as well. And that's, I think, what's good about being in the University of Plymouth, because this is what we're doing. We're training up these sorts of clowns. No, are they all on holiday, the students? They're hardly any here. These guys, because they're taking the reins now for what's going to happen over the next 20 years. And so long as they sort of understand the problems and the priorities and are convinced of what's the right thing to do is, and that's great. And I think that's what I enjoy about working at a university. We've got people who are up for sorting out the problems they've inherited. And I hope they do, because Isla's in the audience. And it's her that needs to be looked after by the generation of students that are coming through now. It's them that are going to be making the decisions about how much plastic we shove in the sea, how much CO2 we put in the atmosphere, what we eat and so forth. Yeah, you're relying on them. Take it out. And so with that, I'd like to finish actually, just to thank all of you guys for listening, and especially my colleagues who, we've got this really good group, the Marine Biology and Ecology Research Centre. We support each other a lot actually, and I rely heavily on them. The students, of course, for such good fun and stimulating, and anyone who's collaborated with me. There's probably, must be 200 people I've worked with so far on scientific publications, and they're invaluable as well.